So Jeremy Nieboer, who's written this book and two others, chap in his early 80s, he gave this talk in Wallingford a couple of years ago. He's a barrister, but what he did, he's a member of the Bruges Group. Now, historically, the Bruges Group were constitutional lawyers, and they gave us all the information as to what the European Union were doing. Well, they branched out a little bit, and he started to look at climate change. In these books, he has given all these references. There are people like Professor Clymer, because Jeremy Nieboer, being a barrister, is a legal expert, not necessarily a climate change expert, but he has gone through the various documents, including the IPCC documents, which is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. So they're the people who are driving the whole climate change agenda. So with that in mind, we've got at least 10 years of his work, 10 years of his research, which is based on scientific research. 90% of this book is the science, and 10% of it is politics, namely the history of how climate change comes about. So, or the climate change agenda comes about. So recently, you know that there was a general election, and there were 7 parties, well there were 6 parties and 1 independent. I was the independent. If you add up myself, Reform and the SDP, we got 11.5% of the vote. The other parties, the Libs, the Labs, the Cons and the Greens, all net zero. So 88.5% of this constituency, Henley and Tame, voted for net zero. They voted for the CO2 climate change agenda. And as we'll discover, it's quite an expensive agenda, and there's absolutely no evidence that supports CO2 driving climate change. So Jeremy Nieboer starts his book with various statements. Let him not be taught science, let him discover it. Jean-Jacques Rousseau in 1762. And I would rather have questions that can't be answered than answers that can't be questioned, Richard Feynman. Because 90% he looks into all the scientific research behind this. His discovery is that this is an anti-human agenda, which we know by this stage, and the purpose is to overthrow prosperity. So on that subject, according to the National Grid, this will cost the UK taxpayer £3 trillion. The current national debt is 2.7 trillion, which means we would effectively double the national debt and more. There's a UKIP guy called Roger Arthur, who was the brains, if you like, behind the Nigel Farages at the time. He suggested that the 3 trillion was the national grid itself. It doesn't include any additional work that would need to happen outside the national grid. He costed that as a further 2 trillion. But we'll go with the low number of 3 trillion. For us to implement this, currently we're spending about £30 billion a year, which means it would take 100 years to implement. Which means, practically speaking, there can't be any climate emergency. This is going to take 100 years to implement. The Lib Dems in the Henley hustings suggested that by in 15 years' time, 2040, they wanted this implemented. That would therefore cost 3 trillion divided by 15, 200 billion a year. And if you remember, the COVID 2 years cost us 400 billion, which is about 200 billion a year. So if you don't like the cost of living crisis today, you're not going to like it for the next 15 years with huge inflation and huge cost increases on absolutely everything. So environmentalism, of course, should be to protect things such as marine life, reduce plastics in the seas, but instead the whole concept, including Greenpeace itself, has been hijacked because Greenpeace, the original founder, has been ousted because, of course, he recognises that this is an enormous scam. We'll start off with a chap called Dan Penner. Dan Penner is an American businessman, a little bit like Alan Sugar. And, you know, what does he know about climate change? But he was asked by somebody in the audience, he told the lady to shut up and sit down. He said, climate change is a complete nonsense. It's a beachfront property. They still sell it. They know that sea levels are not going to rise. He said the banks will give mortgages. The banks, in order to do credit risk, you need quantitative analysts who are mathematicians, who are scientists in their own right, and they will ascertain the risks of the credit risk of me giving you a loan, a mortgage on your property, a beachfront property. And they've ascertained that there is no risk. Similarly, you walk across the street and you need insurance on that property, and you can still get insurance even though the actuaries have calculated that there will be no sea level rises because underwater housing doesn't resell particularly well. And you can't, you'd never get insurance on it. So he pointed out that both the banks and the insurance companies know that it's a scam. So the abstract is that CO2 is essential for life. We are told that carbon dioxide is a pollutant. It's nothing of the sort. We need, in our atmosphere, there are certain things we don't necessarily seem to use, such as nitrogen. Argon, for instance, is at 0.9% of Earth's atmosphere. Nobody even knows much about it. Carbon dioxide is 417 parts per million. That is 0.0417% of the Earth's atmosphere. If CO2 halved and went to about 200 parts per million, photosynthesis in plants would stop, which means that all the greenery would disappear, all your food would disappear, the animals requiring the food, including us, would also disappear, and therefore higher CO2 is actually desirable rather than less CO2. With higher CO2, and you see this as a farmer, you'll see it's in greenhouses, for instance, for tomato plants. You know that tomato plants like a lot of water, they like a lot of light, they like a lot of heat. They also like a lot of additional CO2. So in those greenhouses, farmers pump in additional CO2 to accelerate growth. So if you imagined a situation where you are stood in front of a tree, you take in the atmosphere, particularly the oxygen, you expel less oxygen than you take in, you expel more CO2 than you take in, and a tree or any greenery does precisely the opposite. So the tree or the greenery takes in the CO2 and gives us the oxygen. So it's one of those beautiful cycles of life whereby CO2 and oxygen are absolutely necessary for life to continue. So the increases of CO2 are beneficial. Additional CO2 results in negligible increases in the greenhouse effect. We'll talk a little bit about the science of that later. But if you imagine a situation whereby we in the United Kingdom, for 1% of all of the CO2 emissions, 3% of all the CO2 emissions in the UK is as a result of human. So then you take the 0.1 times 0.3 times 0.417, and you end up with what Jeremy Nieboer describes as a negligible number. He doesn't even give the number, but if you did it on your calculator, it'd be a series of zeros and small numbers. It's so small. Any result of heating as a result of CO2 is tiny, is completely insignificant. There has been no warming trend on Earth since 1998. Cause and effect. There is a correlation between solar activity and climate change, because climate change is going to come from somewhere, and since there's this big yellow hot thing in the sky, there's a very good chance that that actually does the heating rather than the greenhouse gases. Climate environmentalism promotes fear and guilt. Well, pretty much all government agendas these days promote fear and guilt. The IPCC, that's the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, abuses the scientific method. It overthrows the energy base of modern society. So in other words, it doesn't like the idea of oil, gas, coal. And that's the point. We'll learn a little bit later. Since 1850, we've had the Industrial Revolution. And what fueled the Industrial Revolution was coal, oil and gas. Before that, what did we use? Typically windmills and water mills. I'm not hearing that much about water mills right now, but windmills, everyone's excited about them. IPCC knowingly misrepresents global temperature records. It does this in recent years, for the last 150 years, and it does it throughout all of history. A diagram I sent before this meeting, the very first one, shows a 2,000-year history. And that 2,000 years starts in what's described as the Roman warming period. The Roman warming period was about 2 to 3 degrees warmer than it is today. Over the course of 500 years, the temperatures come down. Then the temperatures move up to about 1,000 years ago, which is described as the medieval warming period. Then the temperatures come down again to about 1600, about 400 to 500, sorry, 1600 it would be, so 400, 500 years ago. And that is described as the Little Ice Age. And there are famous paintings of the Little Ice Age where kids are literally playing on the ice on the Thames, so the Thames is frozen over. And then the temperature starts coming up again, and that's where we are today. We're actually coming out of the Little Ice Age. Now, the way the IPCC distort that data, if you were to hold your hand from 1850 onwards, what you see is an upward trend. What they're not showing you is the wavy line beforehand. And the reason 1850 is important is that is the Industrial Revolution. That is the period of time that we started burning coal, oil and gas. Before then, the Romans and the medieval people, they were not burning those fossil fuels. Therefore, if temperatures were higher than they are today, there must be another reason. And that other reason is the sun, natural solar cycles and solar flares. In fact, the last 1,500 years, the temperature generally is less than it's been for the past 10,000 years. So we're actually in quite a cool period generally for the last 1,500 years. Extreme weather events are not indicators of changes in climate. And achieving net zero emissions will have no effect on global temperature. So whether they're low, whether they're zero, or whether they are negligible, which frankly means that they are close to zero, if they go the full course, it will cost this country £3 trillion. Now, I would imagine that it's not even possible to achieve that. Just to spend, it's not possible. The money doesn't exist. You'd have to print it up from the Bank of England. Who would buy the government bonds that quickly? Inflation would be through the roof. So you'd have all sorts of power cut problems. So from a practical perspective, you'd never achieve it anyway. There is no impact of increased CO2 on global temperatures. There is no global temperature abnormality. And there is no correlation between temperatures and CO2 density. So CO2 properties, we've discussed, it's 0.0417% of the Earth's atmosphere. Nitrogen, argon, oxygen all form parts of our wider atmosphere, and CO2 is described as a trace gas, namely it's tiny. So the summary is, the CO2 is essential for life. It's essential for terrestrial and marine life. Now, on the subject of the sea, because everyone considers photosynthesis in plants and considers land, we also have to consider that 2/3 of the Earth's surface is ocean. And in practice, the only thing that can truly heat up that ocean is the sun. It cannot come from the atmosphere above it. What tends to happen is as the temperature throughout a period of time rises, that the sea emits some of the CO2 that it's collected in the cooling periods. And that means that as the world temperature rises, CO2 is emitted, CO2 naturally goes up as a result of solar cycles, and therefore photosynthesis occurs in plants. Since CO2 is more dense than other gases, it falls to the land in order to be absorbed, and you have this accelerated growth in plants. Conversely, the opposite happens, is as the Earth cools as a result of solar cycle cooling periods, that CO2 is absorbed into the sea to be released later on when we have warming periods. So in other words, CO2 cycles follow the sun. It doesn't happen the other way around. CO2 does not drive anything. It follows solar cycles and solar flares. In terms of solar flares, that would be when you have typical heat waves like we had a couple of years ago in 1976. That would be as a result of a solar flare. So then he goes on to talk about increased CO2. CO2, this is the scientific part, the infrared wavelength and absorption sensitivity, which is the Max Planck curve. He talked about this in some depth, and I'll talk about it just for 5 minutes. So additional CO2 to atmosphere will only result in negligible increases in the greenhouse effect. Now, before we talk about that, the main greenhouse gas is water vapour. Water vapour is very, very important as a greenhouse gas because it creates 95% of greenhouse gases is water vapour. The cloud cover up to 9 miles up is what essentially keeps the heat between the cloud cover and the surface of the Earth. At night time, it's about 12% of heat escapes into space. So that cloud cover stops us overheating in the day, and it stops us freezing at the night time.
We need to ban water.
Precisely, yes. Another thing that would kill us if
Zero
we banned
water.
it. Well, I'm sure they can tax it one way or other. You're looking to tax carbon after all.
You can see it because you get a cloudless night in the winter. You get a lot of frost.
Yeah,
And all the heat is starting to disappear off into space.
Yeah,
Whereas overcast, it doesn't. Because it can't get through the cloud.
yes. That's why you see some snow in the Saudi deserts. Sahara Desert doesn't stick, but it gets cold enough to snow. So there's therefore a massive difference between the temperatures, even on the equator, temperatures in the day and the night. But it's all controlled as a result of the greenhouse effect, which in this case is cloud cover, which is water vapour. So the reason that we know about temperature changes are a number of reasons. First of all, we have surface thermometer readings. Well, those can easily be abused and have been by the IPCC. I mean, even the BBC, when they used to tell us the truth, would tell you, you know, be watching Wimbledon, you know, it's 90 degrees out there, but remember, if you want to take the temperature, you put the thermometer in the shade. So you can see that just by moving thermometers around, you can abuse those sort of results. So then he talks about solar radiation, ultraviolet shortwaves and reflecting radiation from its surface, infrared shortwave, which is the process that takes place day and night, and the rest is absorbed by the clouds, evaporation and convection. The altitude, is 7 miles, not 9 miles, 7 miles. 12% of heat is lost into space, and we also, since 1980, have satellite records. So we're pretty confident in what those satellite records are, which is why we know that there hasn't been any significant increase in temperatures. It's also the reason that global warming isn't used anymore. When scientists wrote back to the IPCC and just said there isn't any, so they swapped that phrase out for climate change. So it's the Max Planck curve that determines the spectrum of radiation from warm bodies and describes thermal radiation. And the summary is, if CO2 is doubled, the heat escape or retention is not doubled. It has a minuscule effect. So the conclusion is that the IPCC model trends grossly exaggerate the actual observational trend. The IPCC have not proved that increase in global temperatures since 1850 is caused by the rise in CO2. And they've also not proved it is not due to the heightened solar activity emerging from the Little Ice Age. There has been no warming trend since 1998. Now the ice core data, so Greenland They've done this experiment in various parts of the world. In Greenland, they looked at ice cores. So you take a tube and you essentially pile it down, drive it down, and when they bring it back up, and they put chunks out in front of you, and it'd be a bit like the rings on a tree, except it would be across the table as a tube, and they would be able to tell thousands of years back what the temperatures were at the time, which is why we can go way back beyond 2,000 years to look at these cycles. And therefore, if these cycles have taken place pre-1850, we know that they can have nothing to do with man-made CO2 emissions. In fact, they go back hundreds of thousands of years. All the analysis has now been done, but we typically look at data from about 2,500 years, simply because we can prove just from that alone that man-made climate change is not a thing. So in summary, it's about cause and effect. The cause is the sun, the cause is not CO2 emissions. There's a close correlation between temperature and solar activity. So the next thing he describes is around the dogma around it. So I think Alan asked me before, this one going to be about religion, but in a peculiar way it is, because you've noticed that there are certain people who are determined to cling to the idea that man-made climate change is what's driving some kind of catastrophe. So there is a history here. The history starts in 1972 in Stanford University. And Stanford University came up with the idea that if we can rid ourselves of oil, coal and gas, that effectively will drive up the price of energy. It will drive up the price of everything agriculture, since agriculture or food prices will go up. All agriculture needs energy, transport costs will go up, prices for home energy go up, and of course manufacturing goes up. So of course in the hustings, one of the jokes I said, well, you know, we've got one steel manufacturing plant left, and I said if you want to fire up a steelworks furnace using a windmill, it's probably not going to work. And this is why we've got one Port Talbot steelworks left, if that's working at all. But you can see that if we implement any of this stuff, that's the end of manufacturing. We will not be doing any manufacturing in this country or the West again. You simply won't be able to compete on price or anything else. So after Stanford University came up with the idea, a chap called Maurice Strong decided that this idea needed some gravitas, so he took it to the United Nations, and it was there that they created the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. So this is driven by the United Nations and by the IPCC. And of course, all their predictions have come wrong since the early 70s. You may well remember Dr. Spock, Leonard Nimoy, who gave a prediction of an ice age in the 1970s. He was a great voice actor, but he created a little sort of documentary about how we were about to go into an ice age, which is ironic because of course we're coming out to one. In the 1980s you would have heard about acid rain. In the 1990s you would have heard about ozone layer depletion. In the 2000s we had global warming, but they simply changed the definition, so it became climate change. And then the big summits were the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio, Brazil, and then Paris Climate Accord was developed in 2015, which is where everybody is signed up to. All of the West now is signed up, the European Union signed up. On that subject, the reason that we can't get out of it quickly, if we decided that that's what we wanted to do, is because it's part of the withdrawal agreement from Brexit. So the withdrawal agreement is an anti-competition agreement that the UK has with the European Union, because obviously they can't allow us just to go off and do our own thing and become successful. So you need these anti-competition clauses, one of which is that we will implement net zero. So we will fire up our power stations, we'll fire up our steelworks furnaces with windmills rather than with coal or anything else. Then we have the consensus. Now, communism always needs a good consensus, doesn't it? So the consensus, the 97% consensus, is made up of 94 out of 97 people deciding that this is CO2 emissions, man-made CO2 emissions is a thing. When you look at those people, of course, they're not scientists. In the same way that you look at the World Health Organization, they do have one or two doctors, but largely they don't practice. It's politicians you're looking at. Similarly, World Health Organization and IPCC, it's politicians. Politicians make the decisions. So that your John Kerrys, your Al Gores, and in this country right now it's Ed Miliband. But you know, if he wasn't, if there's another political party, it'd be somebody else. So they maintain the illusion of the consensus. This is also done by paying our media outlets, whether it be Wikipedia, the BBC and the press, to continually pump out propaganda to tell us that there is an emergency and that, you know, every time you see the sun there's a heat wave and it's all it's all your fault because of CO2 emissions and so on. And they continue with that to maintain that illusion. The other thing is around articles, and you see this quite consistently. Half-baked academics, you know, they spend a long time, they get their PhD, but frankly, in the open market, they're not really worth a great deal. So they are paid to provide papers that give specific outcomes. And the outcome, of course, is that man-made CO2 is a terrible thing, it's all your fault. And similarly, peer reviews. You then get more half-baked academics with PhDs who are largely unemployable to rubber stamp this paper and just say it's a thing, and therefore they keep continuing with the concept of the consensus. However, there is a small problem, and that is 23,000 actual scientists, each of whom have either master's degrees or PhDs, have written back to the IPCC and just say, we know that you're lying to us. So it is understood, and this is why you do see on whatever social media platform you're prepared to look at, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Twitter, there are lots of proper scientists just saying this is complete nonsense and we should stop it right away.
Aren't a lot of them retired? That's how they
yes,
speak out.
that's exactly right, yes, because they've got no jobs to do. Yes. Yeah. There's also, interestingly, another retiree, David Galinsky, who has absolutely no involvement. He's a proper open intellectual. His PhD is in philosophy, and he's done postdoctoral work in biology and mathematics. And when they taught him about CO2 emissions and talked about the whole concept of net zero and climate change, he just completely dismisses it. So no, you know, serious academics don't do that. You know, it's low-level academics they give to write these papers. And equally, you see them on the BBC if you know when you do tune into them, and you think, who are these people? They're just some half-baked academic who needs the money. Equally, we saw the same thing with the World Health Organization stuff. The pay packets of people who were pushing that particular agenda came up, and they really weren't that big. You know, they weren't huge sums of money that were necessary to drive those types of agendas. So in summary, climate environmentalism uses science as dogma, it promotes fear, guilt, and the IPC is more a political bureaucracy than a scientific body. Then we have the concept of modelling, computer modelling. Remember we saw, again, there's similarities with the World Health Organization and I think it's Noel Ferguson's model, wasn't it? Now, I know a little bit about this type of modelling because I've worked in investment banks, I've worked in credit risk, market risk, I've worked in insurance companies, and there's absolutely no question you can get these types of mathematical models to work. But of course, once you've got them to work, you put in your data, and if the output is something that you don't like, well, you just revisit the input, don't you? You just make, so this is the way that they manage to get their hockey stick analysis, which shows that there is a crisis, an imminent crisis. And in order to achieve that, once again, they have to eliminate everything, absolutely everything that's before 1850. because that would discredit it. There's no way of hiding the Roman warming period. There's no way of hiding the medieval warming period. If you pump that data into these models, then they don't get the outcome that they want, which is there's an emergency. So therefore, the summary is, the IPCC abuses the scientific method. Its models are displaced by satellite observational evidence. So then he goes to talk on about the IPCC report from August 2021, the summary of policymakers. And again, they knowingly misrepresent the global temperature record over modern times being 1500 years, and the geological path. So sorry, 150 years they misrepresent, over 1500 years and the last 10,000 years they all misrepresent. Almost all of the last 10,000 years the temperatures were higher than they are today. Therefore it cannot be as a result of man-made climate change. And then he looks at other ideas that are put out there, such as extinctions and polar bear losses, and nothing to do with climate change. The greatest threat to polar bears is human hunting. Extinctions, many of those are results of hunting. Arctic ice. Now, Arctic ice is largely floating ice. So if you do a little experiment, and you take your teacup with your boiling water in it, and you place a block of ice in it, it melts and it doesn't overflow. What that tells you is the Arctic ice were to melt, you don't get sea level rises. So the ice would have to melt on land and flow into the sea in order to get any increase in sea level rises. And again, no sea level rises in the last 150 years. Droughts and desertification. Droughts tend to coincide with solar flares, hence 1976 and these warm summers that we have. And the IPCC falsely asserts that climate change CO2 is the cause. The opposite can occur. So deserts can retreat, and we've witnessed them retreating in China and in the lower Sahara. So in summary, extreme weather events, changes to sea levels, cold growth, extinctions, and heat-related deaths are not indicators of changes in the climate. So the conclusion is the CO2 hypothesis is false. Climate change is caused by solar cycles and solar flares. CO2 is not a pollutant, it is a natural gas, just like all of the gases are in the atmosphere. Now, in the case of methane, you've probably heard methane is another pollutant or natural gas, which is a problem. Now, just as CO2 is 417 parts per million, methane is 1.7 parts per million. So nearly 1 part in every half million. So it's such a tiny trace gas that it cannot possibly have any effect whatsoever.
Is that the farting cows?
And that's the farting cows, yeah, that's the reason we've got to cull all the cattle, is because 1.7 parts per million is methane. And of course the great thing about trees is we know that photosynthesis and so on, that they absorb such things as carbon dioxide, but they also absorb a lot of things which are pollutants. Methane is one which isn't a pollutant, but again, these are all natural cycles. Now, with most belief systems, you don't need many people to believe in it. So with this, it's about 8% of people that you're looking at. If you knock on doors and say, you know, man-made climate change, who's a big believer, you're looking at about 8% of people. Most people, of course, in order to drag society along, most people do as they're told, 70–80% generally go along with it. And therefore, the 12% or so that are on the other side of this, who are generally retired and vocal and not necessarily qualifications to do this, we speak out about it, they are of course vilified, which is why the only people that can continue to do this are people that aren't working, because anybody who has a job, eventually, if they have enough of an audience, they will just be castigated and thrown out and vilified. We saw exactly the same thing, of course, with with the World Health Organization and everything that happened 4 years ago.
I think the other element is also the time span, isn't it? Because these ideas have been pushed. I remember buying a book that must have been the late 70s, early 80s, and that was already pushing those ideas of like peak oil and all that sort of stuff. So these ideas have been gradually pushed for the past 40, 50 years.
Yes, yeah. And the difference, I think, between this particular idea and where it is today, in order to implement net zero, you'd have to continue the psychological warfare non-stop. You know, most psychological operations come to an end at some point. You know, wars come to an end. So if you take the Ukrainian war as an example, you know, why would we even need to know about it? But it's necessary. They believe it's necessary to keep that psychological operation, that fear, on this part of the world as well. The problem with this idea of net zero is you have to continue the psychological operation for as long as you continue to push the agenda, which could be for a very long time, or at least until we run completely out of money and everything breaks down.
And in a few generations, because they're hammering it into the kids in the schools and in the universities, you're going to get the majority of people believing it. It will switch to the majority believing it, because that will be their doctrine.
Well, but that's the idea. I mean, I spoke...
If they have their way.
Yeah, well, yes, if they have their way. So I spoke to my son about this, and he sort of came home from school one day and said, you know, in geography they told us all about the climate change agenda, and he said then went to physics and they told us everything that they told us they was wrong. So he's getting both sides of the argument in school.
Well, we'll soon stop that physics.
But I think the one thing where they have a little problem is that obviously they're bringing in all these sort of practical solutions, so to speak, like your electric cars, or it was quite interesting today. We had a boiler, a guy come around to look at our gas boiler, and so we talked to him about the topic.
Yes.
And he said he's now going around properties and ripping out their air source heat pumps. Yes. Because these people are sitting there in the winter and freezing their walls off. Yes. And they've got gas, they've got electricity bills of £1,500 per month to run these things. Yeah, and he's going around and ripping these things out again, because people can't afford to run them, and if you're paying £1,500 a month for your electricity, in one winter you have paid for your new gas boiler. So it actually makes sense economically to put the gas boilers back.
Yes, yeah.
So the agenda is very hard to keep this agenda going, because also electric cars, you can't sell them second hand or once. So already people are copying on.
The plumbers and
so
people.
To keep this going, it's going to be really hard work.
Yes.
But then what they will do is they'll legislate so that you can't have a gas boiler.
Exactly, and he was saying they've now brought legislation in that once you've put in
a gas boiler.
No, once you put in a heat pump, you're not allowed to put your gas boiler back.
Yeah.
So is that the law?
Yeah.
Where you said they're ripping out.
Well, when they ring him and say, oh, we want to put the gas boiler back in, and he asked them, oh, have you kept your old one? And some clever people said, well, just in case, we'll keep the old one. And it's kind of still sitting there but not being used. So then he can go in, then it's just a replacement.
Yes.
Yeah. So there is a way around it, but if you've gotten rid of your old gas boiler, you cannot put them back in.
Yeah.
How could they check up there?
I mean, they'll check up on sales of houses. So if you ever wanted to sell your house, as an example, you could never sell it if you had a gas boiler. They'll bring in that type of legislation.
But they'll bring in EPC ratings to houses. They've already been doing this for rental properties, where if your house is not, say, rating of C or above, then it won't be mortgageable and you won't be able to sell it.
Yes.
That's the way they're going to bring it in through the back door, I think.
Yeah.
I'm sure you'll try and do all this stuff but I think it's going to collapse before it will collapse.
Mine just won't move.
If we ever achieve net zero, there will be no lights, we'll have nothing to eat.
Yeah. Well,
I think people are going to wake up if they don't have heating.
Yes, they will wake up.
Yeah.
But eating, they're pushing the fake meats and
They'll
they're
be
pushing
demonstrating.
insects and they're pushing fake food anyway.
Oh, this lab-grown meat.
Lab-grown,
Oh.
yeah.
What is it?
Yeah.
I don't even know. Anyway. Have you tasted it? No, no thank you. Sorry.
but on the subject, well, this is exactly going in the direction that we're looking at. So heat pumps, as an example. I know we've discussed this before. You have to build a brand new house sealed around a heat pump. We've got a whole load of Victorian, perfectly decent housing stock, but to seal it, it's not really not possible, and therefore a heat pump is always going to be, it simply will not work. The moment you go, the moment the outside temperature is below zero, they really don't work at that point at all. But the way that they will bring them in is some kind of mechanism to tax. First of all, Trudeau, for example, is bringing in a carbon tax, and if they've got them in Canada, they will bring one.
And that gets bloody cold in the winter.
Yes,
So
exactly.
nice.
And the sales tax, you will not be able to sell your house unless it's fully upgraded, which means that you'll have to sell it back to a third party, let's say a government institution or BlackRock, yeah. And they will purchase it, they will upgrade the house, and then you'll find yourself renting. Hence you will own nothing and won't be very happy. Electric vehicles, as we've discussed, there are already big problems. Germany's rolling back the date. They don't like 2030, they're saying 2035. They will roll it back again because people aren't going to buy them. I mean, even this little experiment here, that's a 300-watt battery. You compare that to, let's say, to a petrol generator, and the cost of running the two things, the petrol generator, which has been around forever, despite all the tax on petrol, it's still cheaper, still more efficient if things go down. So electric vehicles then, they have problems with the physical weight. They have problems with the fact that the mining of the materials such as lithium and cobalt, the fact that they are unsafe in terms of they set on fire, and they set the battery next to them on fire, and then the one next to them again, and they keep exploding until they discharge fully. The price is way too high. You take the things back and they're worth a tiny fraction of what you originally paid for them. After about 6 years, you probably could change the batteries anyway, which means that you've got another cost of £20,000. So financially, they're not viable.
And the range as well.
And the range.
You have to sit and wait for them to charge if you're on a long journey. You can't just splash and go like you can with petrol or diesel.
Yes.
Electric vehicles are completely missold. It's stupid. We've all had electric vehicles.
Yes.
I mean, you remember milk floats on airports, so these little electric tugs that used to spin. And it worked fine within the limited area that they could work in.
Yes, limited area and limited speed.
Yes, absolutely. So you could have one on the drive as long as you never went more than 100 miles there or back.
And their only benefit was at 4 o'clock in the morning they're quiet.
Yes.
But from what I've read this week, electric vehicles are on their way out anyway. Elon Musk is starting to lose money.
Yeah.
And the Germans, is it Volkswagen or with the large German company now that the whole thing is folded?
Yeah, I think Volkswagen has stopped.
I think Mercedes as well.
The Mercedes. Yes. I knew it was one or two of the Germans, and I think the French as well.
Toyota as well.
And
Toyota.
Just as a matter of interest, which is a philosophical point really, I don't think you really touched on this. A friend of mine who, he's a proper PhD, he works, obviously everybody here works in sort of harbour or whatever, and he said to me, do you know what the most polluted place in the world is? I said, no. And he named it, and it's a place in China. And it is, he said, that is the most polluted place in the world, and they're allowing people to dig this stuff up and they're dying because of it in order to give us net zero.
Yeah, that's the magnets for windmills.
Yeah.
Yeah. So all of this so-called green stuff, all of these materials that they're physically having to mine, you need energy to mine, and cost-effective energy is back to oil, gas and coal again. Then these dangerous materials that they're putting into batteries, putting into windmills, you know, they're mined by youngsters in Africa, they're mined by Chinese, they're dangerous, you know, people are becoming sick from them, all in order to achieve net zero, which is supposed to be clean energy, and deal with a pollutant which isn't a pollutant. So then when you look at the life cycle, for instance, of a windmill, you need a lot of steel, which means you need a lot of iron ore. If you need to create steel, you need a lot of heat in the furnaces to heat the stuff up. Then of course a lot of heat to continue to fold the steel to make it high quality steel. Then you could physically manufacture each of the blades and the posts. You could transport them, you could assemble them. If they're offshore, that's a complex thing in itself. But even if they're onshore, you need a huge concrete base, which you can't exactly describe as green. Physically erect them, and then you could run them. They need a diesel engine to start them. A diesel engine, if they're not if there isn't enough wind to physically move them. They're bird killers. They do break down, of course. They need a lot of support work. You need a lot of engineers with those specific skills that can get out there and physically work on them, change the part, replacement parts. And they have a life cycle, depending on which runs maybe 10 to 15 years. In that time, and then of course you have to bring them down, take them away, and they're pretty much good for landfill, with all of the additional energy that's required for the transportation to put them away. And the view is that they give very little energy in addition to their life cycle energy.
They won't give any. They won't even make the amount of energy that they took to make it in the first place, manufacture it. Because most of them, when you look at them, they're not moving.
It's going to it's all going to collapse, isn't it? It's got to. It can't survive.
Well, that's right, yeah.
It can't
It's
survive.
pretty much, you will never achieve net zero,
No.
but in its pursuit, if it's allowed to continue, it will bankrupt us, and you will be cold at night, and you will not be able to travel very far and so on.
There's, I think it's Lincoln down, isn't it? They're planning 140 miles worth of pylons. And of course all the locals in all the areas are really up in arms because it's going to be really, really ugly.
Yeah.
Just pylons, pylons, pylons.
And there's compulsory purchases,
Yes.
and I understand that the Crown Estate has done a 60 billion deal
Yes.
with the Labour Party in order to erect these things as well.
So the Royals should be benefiting from it.
Yes, so you'll be glad to know the Royals will do very, very well out of it.
Charlie boy who didn't pay any inheritance tax,
Yeah.
because of course they're royal, they don't have to.
You're not cynical.
Oh. Yes.
But the funny thing is, apparently these windmills, because they often are planted in parks, they actually cause local climate change, because they change the wind conditions that kind of cause an updrift in the air, which dries out the local area. So they actually cause what they're supposed to prevent.
Yeah. And they kill wildlife, including rare birds as well.
They catch fire and stuff fairly regularly.
Yeah. Which goes back to this dangerous material that they mine.
Sometimes we just feel they want to destroy man, but they also want to destroy the world. You know?
It does feel like that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that they will destroy the world, because the thing with the concept of biodegradability, I mean, iron ore comes from the ground, so you know, if you put one of these pylons back in here, it will take forever to biodegrade, but most rubbish goes into landfill. But I think a more likely event is a depopulation type agenda, if they get that far.
They're putting them on farmland as well, aren't they?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah,
that was
And solar panels as well, of course.
There were
That's
just
another
solar
one.
panels. How do they fare?
We've got solar panels.
Solar panels work because we know people have got solar panels. I know somebody who's mathematically worked them out, and he worked out when in the real peak of the gas prices, it was only then that they sort of became viable. But the solar panels are good if in the sense that you can be off-grid with them. But I do know a little bit about solar panels because that's the type of company I'm working for right now. And I can tell you that Texas doesn't just have big beef cattle and big hats, it also has big hailstones. Because entire parks have been, and it also has huge solar panel parks which have been heavily damaged. So
it just takes one big hailstone to take an entire park out.
Yeah.
I mean, solar panels are a mature technology, and I know a bit about them because I have on my boat quite significant solar panels. So you can sail off-grid and have electricity, which is wonderful. And they last a long time, even in a harsh marine environment, but they lose 10% effectiveness every year at the end of the life cycle sort of thing. But they still last forever, but there is no place to recycle them.
Yes, that's right.
And they're a terrible impact on the environment when if they don't landfills.
And they cover fields with them, which we could be using some, for some food. So that, their objective will be to cover as much land as they possibly can with.
Yeah, I watched a video where they said they're paying farmers to not grow food, or to plant food that fails by not looking after it, and then using the land to put solar panels on it.
We put 10 solar panels on our roof. It's part of the experiment, really. And technically, if they work at 100%, we get 4 kilowatts, but we don't. It doesn't matter. And we've got a couple of batteries. And like I was telling you, we've got a slight technical issue with the hot water one, but that'll go away. But we don't use any electricity from the grid whatsoever. And even in the winter, it makes a significant thing. Now, I don't know how to put it out of recycling.
Yeah, well, they don't recycle. And the sad thing about them is that the most reflective material, I think, or at least one of them, is silver. Yeah. And silver, whenever it goes into anything, it's never reclaimed. So all of this is.
Then you'll be able to reclaim it.
Well, so it's too difficult to reclaim.
Well, this is the point. It's a precious metal, and yet they always have to. But the problem is you'd have to melt down to reclaim it. You'd either have to melt down the whole piece or go digging around to get the precious metal out of it.
That's how they used to do it if there was smelting ore. That's how they would get the precious metal out of the rock.
Yeah. Well, if you consider that if this goes the way it goes, namely that we will all, be poverty stricken, then things like that type of recycling will come back.
Yeah.
And the rag and bone man type scenario where you reclaim everything, that will come back.
But I really do feel that actually they are destroying our world.
Yeah.
And that I find really difficult. And obviously they're pushing this agenda.
Yes. It's the same
in thinking, that it's the good agenda to have, we're saving the world, but actually they're not.
Well, it depends. The politicians at the top, at the IPC level and above, they know what they're doing. They're essentially.
An agenda.
Oh yeah, they know exactly what they do. The idea is clearly to impoverish people, and
there's a systematic impoverishment going on, isn't it?
Yeah. It's the 8% of UK population that think it's a good idea. They don't know what's going on, but the people at the top understand exactly what's going on.
Can I ask you about when you were talking about rising sea levels and you said about the polar ice cap? I mean, we hear a lot about the polar ice cap breaking down, melting, etc. But nobody ever talks about the Antarctic. Polar, except ice. So why is that not a feature? Why is that not an issue? I mean, I've seen the different arguments for a spherical globe, flat Earth, etc., and the ice wall around. So where in that example, then the polar ice cap's in the middle.
Yeah.
So is the polar ice cap actually melting or not?
Well, it's clearly not making a difference to whatever's happening. I don't know the answers. Whatever's happening, it is not changing sea levels.
Yeah.
I take an interest in the polar ice cap and Antarctica. because I'm a sailor.
Enlighten me.
And there is no fucking issue. The Antarctic ice levels are at the peak of where they've been now for 50 years, just this year. And there was a time when you could sail the North Passage up past Greenland and across the Pacific Ocean and Alaska. And there were 2 or 3 years they were able to do that. But the last 2 years they haven't been able to do that because the ice levels are absolutely fine. And the polar ice caps are doing extraordinarily well. As are the bloody Great Barrier Reefs. Are fantastic. And they were supposed to wash out, weren't they?
Oh yeah, that's what they're supposed to die.
No, they're absolutely not. They've never been healthier. No, we don't hear much of that.
Of course, big weapons, David Attenborough.
Yeah.
I know.
You're not giving him all these accolades and awards and Nieboer.
But see, here we are sitting, all of us with our different PhDs, and we've worked out that this is all nonsense, right?
Yeah.
But what I find so difficult is that 90% of people believe in it.
Well, I'm not convinced.
It's too easy to just go.
I don't think that 90% of people believe in it. I think a very small number believe in it. But people, if you want to move society, you just get the right people, the David Attenboroughs, who, as we know,
and then
and you know, his job is to push
I
the
think
agenda.
the majority of people believe in global warming, and they cite strange weather. Oh, the weather's so strange. But they believe. I really believe they do. And I was doing carpentry work for a chap who was taking his PhD in global warming
Studies.
meteorology stuff. And he was a really good guy. I was doing carpentry work on him, so I was kind of the humble man. But he was a young kid in a £1.5 million house in Oxford, and that bank and mum and dad must have bought for him. And he had a delightful wife, and there was these 2 young kids. And I said, but you don't believe in global warming, do you? Oh, yes, I do.
Well, you can phrase the question better than that. So
well, no,
global warming exists, it's because it's driven by the sun. So you have to say it's a man-made CO2 emissions global warming.
He was so fearful, it was unbelievable. He did a total state change. And this was a chap who served in Afghanistan on the military side, coming back to do his PhD in global warming science. And of course, one engaged, didn't one, and had a conversation and said, you are a fuckwit. I was kinder than that, obviously, but he would not budge because his future mortgage depended on it. So he would not budge on it, but he was genuinely fearful as well.
But is it not the fear that's infectious rather than the knowledge? Is it because
2 weeks later,
can come in on very many levels, can't it?
of course, but we had a big conversation about it. 2 weeks later, I sent him. There was a thing that a bunch of scientists, 400 scientists or whatever, headed up by a couple of Nobel Prize winners, said climate, global warming, man-made global warming is not a thing. It doesn't exist. It's nonsense. So I was very pleased to find the thing, sent it to him, and 2 days later, I get a reply. Oh well, Dan, this is a little bit like David Icke stuff, isn't it? Because the Nobel Prize winners, they weren't even Nobel Prize winners in meteorology, were they? Or climate science. They were just chemistry.
Well, that was the main objection.
And it was just the weirdest bloody exchange.
Well, you run into a lot of these people. We did at the hustings.
Yes.
And they're so thick, they're not worth talking to. I don't bother arguing with them. It's a waste of time.
You can't.
It's like trying to, somebody once said, it's an old saying, it's like trying to teach a pig to dance. It's a waste of your time and it annoys the pig. Sorry.
Well, 2 years ago with Jeremy Nieboer, we had a lady in the front row because Steve Beattie was a local councillor at the time. He wanted to bring councillors in and say, look, we should not be influencing this. So you got Jeremy Nieboer over. And we asked all comers in. And most people actually handing flyers out in the street, you know, oh, we mustn't even talk about, too dangerous to even talk about. But it's very rare that people like that will come through the door. So the ones that did, one came in to ask who was paying for the event. It can't be the council. And then once we explained that, no, don't worry, it's not the council, you know, it's privately funded. He wandered out, and Lorenzo was on the door, bouncing for us, said he was sat on the steps, shaking. And then The other person, because he was so angry that the Wallingford should even be hosted, even be discussing a topic like this. It's just dangerous.
Well, on Facebook, when you were hosting the thing with the Right Said Fred, there were people so angry that we were using the town hall for this event.
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, the mind spell is strong.
And there's a lady in the front who claimed to have a master's degree in climate change studies. And she was, of course, she was the main person arguing with Jeremy Nieboer. And of course, Jeremy Nieboer being a lawyer, a barrister, he said, well, I'm used to stand up in front of people arguing cases, so that's the way I put my books together. And she said, oh, but you're a lawyer, not a climate scientist. Yeah. So I pointed out to her, look, there's 100 footnotes in here. They're all scientists. Yeah. He's picked up, but no, that doesn't help. That doesn't help the argument. In fact, it's a well put together book. So yes, when you're dealing with these people, it's very, very difficult. Hence, 88.5% of people voted for their own impoverishment in Henley to vote for net zero.
I heard something really funny today that kind of fits in with that, with all the evidence. There's just so much evidence, isn't there?
Yeah.
And it was Senator Ron Johnson said it. It's like being a mosquito at a nudist camp. There's so much evidence, you just don't know. Yeah. You could pick anything, isn't it? And still.
Yeah. The one which, of all the arguments I use, which is the best one, is the historical back test. It's from 1850 onwards. That's the one that's got to be blocked by NASA and all sorts of various people on Twitter. Ultimately, if you give them that, that's the one that they can't really contest because the models don't deal with it.
I like the pictures of global warming and sea change of the Statue of Liberty from 1903 and the Statue of Liberty last year, and there's no fucking difference. It's just exactly the same.
Well, they had to lift it, bring it up.
I think one of the problems in all this is we're spending so much energy on this nonsense. We're not paying attention to their environment enough because we are polluting it.
Absolutely.
They really don't seem to care about it. You would have thought, well, plastics in the sea, maybe let's deal with that. They've got no interest at all in the environment.
And all the COVID masks, all those blue masks everywhere. Getting everywhere, polluting everywhere.
But it's the way it's so inverted because CO2 is actually the life giver.
Yes.
It's not a poison, it's not a toxin, it's something that we need desperately more of.
That's what they do, the world is important.
And you buy packaged stuff from the supermarket, and quite often I should think the cost of the packaging exceeds the contents, and then you've got to throw that away. What sense does that make? It doesn't make any sense at all.
Well, there is one important angle, it pushes the price up, which makes it more difficult for you. You see, if you pre-electric cars, if you take the concept of, any car really, European Union just gave us dozens and dozens and dozens of regulations on cars. So you can say, well, a seatbelt, that's going to be useful, isn't it? So we'll give them that. But then water-based paint. I mean, we used to have paint shops all around the country, And the next thing you know, you've got this water-based paint, which is really, really difficult to stick on the car. And the price goes up. So you've got all of these regulations. What they've managed to do is put all the bells and whistles on the car to push the price up. So all that's happened is we've got a temporary transition to electric vehicles which won't quite work.
No,
and then by the time you've gone back, have you seen the price of a 10-year-old, 15-year-old car now? They're not.
Is that right? I'm not
you look at the price of cars, I dread to imagine what a new lot would cost.
Well, having just spent some weeks in America, they all have these bloody pickups. Huge, and I love them, they're fantastic. They've got these massive wheels and they're built up like this. And every boy wants one, including myself. But I asked, how can you guys afford it? We just bought them. And they cost $80,000 each one. We all have one. And it's all on the borrow. And so they're debt slaving themselves as well.
That'll come to an end at some point. If it reaches a point, you just can't borrow anymore.
So how about hybrid cars then?
Because I thought that hydrogen.
That would, no, hybrid.
But hydrogen. The reason I mentioned hydrogen bonds itself to everything, doesn't it, including oxygen. So we wouldn't want to go down the hydrogen route, would we? Because, well,
right, I have heard hydrogen is really good.
Yeah, and you can hybrid those great big pickups with with
gas?
No, with water.
Okay.
So you use that electrolysis to pass the hydrogen and the oxygen, and that brings down your 20 miles per gallon. It creates your 30 or 35 to the gallon.
Well, the petrol over there is 1/3 the cost you're only paying again.
Yeah.
They want to bring in hydrogen in relation to heating as well.
Yeah.
I thought with a hybrid car, so you use the petrol to get it going,
Yeah.
and then, you know, a car charges itself, because that's how they work. So then it's self-charging as well, so you're not using any other fuel.
Yeah, but once it charges, you start with the battery.
Oh, there's the battery in it, yeah, but it's not the same as an electric car battery, is it?
Yeah, no, I
because
don't
they've been
know.
around a lot longer.
But the point is a hybrid, well, let me give you a different example. You could argue that your petrol car is a hybrid because what's to stop you using another fuel in it, which emulates petrol?
When I had a Land Cruiser, which was diesel, the cost of fuel went ridiculously high, and the cost of buying vegetable oil was extremely low.
Yeah.
Yes.
That was a great opportunity.
Yeah.
I had a friend who did that.
And you just drive along and smell like a fish and chip shop.
But the point is, you've already proved your car is a hybrid car.
We've got a friend who's
No,
wanted to
but
say.
mine's petrol now, so you can't put vegetable oil in petrol.
No, but there are other fuels that can be used even in a petrol engine. I mean, I'd have to research it. But again, you see, there's two problems. The first thing is the reason that our price of petrol is 3 times the price. Most of it's tax, 45% is tax. And then the second thing is you reach a point where, like your oil in the diesel, then you will just find an alternative fuel to keep the thing going, even in a petrol car. A sympathetic alternative.
So you want to say something about Mercedes?
Synthetic.
Or sympathetic, yeah, sympathetic.
Of course, if you all have electric cars, I'll ask you about electrician.
Well, yes, and they can switch them off at any stage.
And they're all going to be trackable, and they're going to start, I think in the EU, and certainly in the US, they're going to start controlling your speed limit as well.
Yes.
Essentially, the AI is going to control everything on your car.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know. It will just stop. They want it to stop. It will stop. Because they have auto stop.
And our 14-year-old.
I've got a couple of Chinese motorbikes. One is sort of quite raw, great little thing, forgetting about the larger one. It's got all of the electronics. There's clearly a tracker on it, so you can tell exactly the speed you are, where you are. So obviously you can take that stuff off. But my point is, for the Chinese market, then they're tracking them all over the place.
Yeah.
Already.
To your point about making it more expensive, the other thing that's so an issue is that they have to deal with obsolescence.
Yeah.
And being a bit of a petrol head and having my favourite car from 1963, it's perfect. It just fucking works. I mean, it keeps up with because it's so basic.
Yeah,
you know?
Combustion
Yeah,
engine,
exactly.
that's it.
But I mean, my wife and I curse about this when it comes to fridges and household appliances because they only last 3 years.
Yeah.
And it's impossible to buy something that lasts longer. When I grew up, my grandparents said, well, if I don't get 30 years out of my fridge, I'm going to go back to it.
Gone for about 10 years.
30 years expectancy for a fridge.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, they just kept going.
They just were designed to keep going.
Well, going back to motorcycle engines, it's the same thing, isn't it? Those old Hondas, and then the Chinese have copied the Kawasaki engines. Those things will last decades.
Yeah.
All you need is somebody that can keep them going.
Yeah.
A lot of them fake, they have semi-vintage cars now every year, and all these old Morris Marinas and things, and Morris or whatever they are, sitting out there with bonnets up, and you look inside the engine, and it's lovely. It's so simple, you can get everything, you know. You think, oh, what happened?
What happened, exactly. What happened? Yeah. Inverted. Inverted.
And then going back to farmland, going back to farmland, we were discussing how they're first of all putting solar panels on the farmland, and secondly, I know that some farmers are being paid to essentially seed to take it back to nature.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I've got a lot of those pre the hustings, a lot of questions about, clearly it's the United Nations agenda, to rewilding 30% of nature, and that's what a lot of people have been paid to do. And of course,
you should just go in there and get all the herbs and use them for medicine instead.
But you know how Hemingway would say that how long does it take for someone to go bankrupt? First happens very, very slowly and then all at once.
yes.
Are we, how close to the all at once are we now?
I think we could be quite close. If you take American debt as an example, in principle, they've got 125 debt to GDP. Now, there's a period pre-European Union where we said 60% is bad. The United Nations said, 77%, then it starts getting nasty. Now, with 125%, you can still come back because Britain has had a couple of wars and, they've had that sort of debt. But you have to say, right, 400,000 in the civil service, thanks very much, you're on your bike. Right, you've got 6 million in the public sector. So we need some of those doctors and nurses, rest of you on your bike, your diversity, inclusion, rights, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Done all that, don't need it. But nobody, not one of the main parties has said that here or in the United States. And that tells you that we are heading towards bankruptcy if we continue doing what we're doing.
Yeah.
There's only so far you can tax, and then people, my kids' generation say, well, Dubai looks quite good, there's no tax there, why not? So then, when the people leave the country, do the actual work and pay the tax, then you're left with an Argentinian type scenario, where 70% have government jobs. So then the only alternative is to lay them all off. So in answer to your question, it could get bad very quickly.
That's what it feels like, but it's felt like that for a few years now. And I don't want to doom monger or anything like that.
They can't increase interest rates much without crippling the government debt. They won't be able to service the debt. So
because if everybody has their houses,
can't we just
has their houses repossessed, what will they do with all the people that have
I don't think they particularly care about the people. I'm talking more about government operations.
But then if they don't have anywhere to live, then they won't be able to have their jobs, and then it's the whole cycle.
Well,
nobody cares about people.
But you're saying if people don't pay their taxes, then there's no money to run the country on.
Well, money's not the issue, they print more.
Yeah, they do,
And devalue your savings.
And take your savings.
A few years ago, about 5 years ago, I got an expected lump sum from a pension thing. My company, they went broke and left out. Funny, I got it so unexpected. So like a good little chap, I went and gave it Standard Life, assets. And recently, I thought, hang on, if I'd taken that lump sum and bought some gold with it, I looked up, 60% of the gold would have done. 60%.
And still done, it's been crazy.
But, there you are. And nobody told me that then. I know that now.
Well, I came up with an interesting statistic on house prices since 1953 in the UK and in the United States. So, in the UK, how much have house prices gone up since 1953?
God knows, a lot.
Yeah, well, let me stop you there because you're pricing it incorrectly. You're pricing it in a debt-based currency which is devalued.
So it hasn't gone up at all, really?
So, yeah, that's correct. So if you price it in gold, actually it's not gone up in this country. In the United States, it's gone down since 1953. But there's another problem apart from your debt-based currency, and that is your wages.
Exactly.
Because since 1953, a man in the UK and the United States could probably purchase a property with 2 times salary. Now it's 8 times salary, 12 times salary, and you need 2 people working. So the moral of the story is that's how badly they've distorted the currency and the housing market. Gold has done.
But is it systematic impoverishment?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and you've just done nice and slow, so nobody's really seen it to this
and
point.
that's why both the husband and the wife have to work.
Well, you need 3 jobs.
It used to be just 1 salary, and now people are struggling on 2 salaries.
But then the climate change is just a device to make that faster.
Yes, to accelerate.
To impoverish us faster.
Yes.
Interesting,
And they're even giving, councils are getting because you've got the change agents in the councils now. And that's why they're having all these town mayors. It's all part of the Agenda 2030.
Yes.
They're going to have
they're cascading power down to the mayors.
And the mayors have absolute power, and you have these assemblies of upstanding members of the community, but they will rule with a rod of iron. It's all getting it's all getting farmed out, but you know, you will obey. You won't have any say in what they're telling you to do. And they've got all the change agents in the council as well, haven't they?
Yeah.
Which is all watching climate change. And apparently, you know, Sandy Adams, who's the climate change expert now, who took over from Rose Forest. Have you seen any of Sandy Adams? She's the queen of climate change in our country, and one of the top people with UN Agenda 2030.
Yeah.
So a big part of that is climate change. And where I'm going with.
Was she the lady that gave a talk to a council?
Yes.
Yeah, she challenged the Glastonbury Council.
She's been looking at a lot of, you know, 15 minute cities,
Yes.
which is all from the council.
Yes.
All from the council.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
And of course, that's the whole thing of electric cars. They're going to be temporary, and in the end, they want people to have no cars.
Yes.
I think they'll be used for Ubers. I think they'll be driverless Ubers. They'll be used as taxis, and you'll have your carbon credits, and you'll only be able to get a taxi or your walk or cycle.
In Holland, they're talking about car sharing already, so I think one car between 3 or 4 families. Yeah,
they're going to price everyone out of having a car at all because they want to get. They've made it clear they want to get rid of personal transport. They don't want anyone to have personal transport. That's the way it's going.
Well, they have that in London already, where you can you have this. A bit like with the bicycles, but it's with cars, isn't it? Where you can join a club and then you can tell you where the nearest car is available to use, and then you can use it to drive where you want to go, and then you leave it, and then somebody else can come and use it.
Well, London's not so bad, is it? Because it's got very good public transport.
Yeah, well,
it's
completely horrendous. You couldn't get anywhere, could you?
I've known people who live in London, they haven't even bothered learning to drive.
Yeah.
They felt they can't need to. So it's a completely different culture in London, I would say, or certain parts of London.
Yeah, you get
Well,
around
that's
from
why
the
they want
tube
the
bus.
15-minute cities, isn't it? To do that.
How can they afford the train?
So that we
Use of the underground
overuse transport within that.
Oh, well, it's a bleak prospect, isn't it? We're governed by idiots, and we just kind of, you know, hunker down and do the best you can.
Well, people at the top
Well,
making the
just
plans are very devious and very clever.
Yeah, they
The
know
idiots
what to
are the useful idiots are all in the
I don't think
councils
they're
further down.
as clever as
Sorry,
they
I've
think.
got to go. I've got a call and I've got to go. Can somebody deal with that? Which is
Yeah.
the.
We will, yes.
Do you know what to do? Do you know the number?
Yes, I do.
Oh, Chris,
Well,
got that one.
Yeah.
Okay, good luck.
I've got to go.
See you, Anne.
I mean, the elites are a very, very tiny proportion of the whole population, minute. And I can't believe that there are a lot more people out there who are a lot smarter than they are, who they don't know about, and I just hope
Yeah, but they can't
They're
organise
doing their
themselves.
employ, aren't they?
Well, some will be able to, some will.
But the funny thing is, at the moment, there's like events happening at such an incredible
I know.
speed,
Yeah.
isn't it?
I
It's
know.
like each day something is happening that is pretty sort of earth-shaking, isn't it? And yet the next day there's already the next thing
Yeah.
and the next thing, so nobody
My
talks.
speed is 10 watt the fucks per hour.
Yeah.
All bubbling up.
It's sort
But
of
is that because you're aware of it, because you're tuning into
There's too many things.
terrestrial television?
There's the
or-
Muslim thing, and there's the border thing, and there's all that refugee stuff, and there's the tax.
Now there's
economy.
two
There's the net zero.
knife crimes.
There's the
back to back,
satanic stuff.
which I think are probably both false
Knife
flags.
crime, yeah. It's too many things now.
Yeah.
It's
But if you
systematic
don't
delivery.
don't read the newspapers, don't watch the news, and you're not subject to it.
Yeah.
But I think that they're
And
getting
but
all
they
the
want
fear
you to be
porn.
subject to it. They
Yeah.
want you to be.
Like the latest ones, the
if you
kids
choose
were
not
knifed
to live
and
with fear.
And interestingly, they were doing some Taylor Swift dance school thing, and she sent a letter, and she's well in the system. You know, a bit
But
like
I
the
was-
Ariana
I was-
Grande thing.
I was over in Baltimore, and we did a road trip down to Charleston, my family and my 2 boys, and we rented a car and stayed in hotels. At the time when Trump had his ear attack.
Oh yeah, we watched all that last week.
And it was
Joke.
just so fucking funny, because I'm going into the hotel, we're having our breakfast in the morning, television there, pumping 24/7 the Trump thing. And I'm sitting there thinking, I've been trained on this. This is an absolute psyop, because they're
Yeah,
cranking it
yeah.
24
We
hours
watched
a day.
That was
For those
the
2 or
ones
3
that
days.
came last week. We watched Ollie Damagard's take on
Yeah,
it.
I've listened to him on Dellingpod.
all the way through.
It's so good.
Because as soon as the
But they've
British
only been
came out,
pumping it for a day or two, and then they've been pumping Kamala Harris.
And the Olympic, as a
Well, they're going to keep you on one side or the other.
I know, but they just
keep out of it.
because if you follow the news in America, you are constantly bombarded with psyop. It just doesn't stop.
But it's deliberate. They want
It
you
is.
to live in fear.
Yeah.
So the only way to do it is to not watch the news. Don't listen to the news. Don't
Exactly.
really
Like
expect
none of us do.
Yeah.
Don't watch the Olympics.
No, I don't watch any of it,
But
actually.
Well, the Olympics are all right. This is
Well, no, the
the
problem-
people in the Olympics are just doing their best. And
Of
they're
course
fighting.
they have to defile the Olympics because that's about the human spirit doing its
The
thing and being
wonderful
wonderful.
people
So they have
doing
to
it.
defile
I saw some of the gymnastics earlier, and the girls are amazing.
They are.
You know, some of the feats.
But if they
that
can
do.
sneer it and make it a bit nasty, then they will.
Oh, they do.
So, when are you going to talk about Satanism?
Can do. Talk about the Olympic Games if you like.
Well, you can talk about that too, then.
I have you. I have no knowledge.
The thing I sent a link to also was the Song Imagine, which the guy was calling it, the Song Imagine is the Communist Manifesto.
Yes, that's right, yeah.
And it's really interesting how everybody loved that song. I used to love that song. It's one of my favourite songs in the 70s.
Which was that song?
Imagine by John Lennon.
Imagine.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
And you read the words with a different comprehension now, don't
They
you?
were all, that was always the meaning. But some people, Mike Williams was into Beatles. The Beatles were a tax stop band.
Yeah.
They were an artificially created band. A lot of people wouldn't believe this. Sorry.
Yeah,
And I think Mike Williams said he doesn't even believe that John Lennon actually wrote Imagine. That was definitely setting the scene for the way the world is going. And the plan, that was the plan. And everybody's been singing it. And they have this girl who's well.
Sorry to derail your meeting.
Well, that's okay. We're pretty much finished now, so any final questions?
So what was the name of the book, Jeremy something?
Yeah.